September 4th, 476 AD. A teenage emperor named Romulus Augustulus is removed from power in Ravenna. No battle, no siege, just a quiet transaction between a barbarian general and a boy who held a title that no longer meant anything. This is traditionally marked as the fall of the Roman Empire, but that's not when Rome fell. Rome had been collapsing for decades, and the truly unsettling part? Almost no one saw it happening. This is the story of how the most powerful system in human history disintegrated from within, and why those who lived through it barely noticed until it was far too late. History 1. To understand the collapse, you first need to understand what Rome was at its height. By the 2nd century AD, Rome controlled the entire Mediterranean basin. 50 million people lived under a single legal system. Roads connected Britain to Jerusalem. Aqueducts brought water to cities of 500,000 people. A citizen in Gaul could use the same coinage as a merchant in Egypt. It wasn't just size, it was integration. Rome built the most sophisticated administrative state the world had ever seen. Tax records, legal courts, standardized weights and measures, professional standing armies. The empire wasn't held together by a single leader, it was held together by systems. And those systems worked because of one crucial element: trust. Trust that Roman law would be enforced. Trust that grain would flow from Egypt to feed Rome's urban poor. Trust that legions on distant frontiers would remain loyal. Trust that currency held value. But trust is fragile, and once it begins to erode, it accelerates. By the early 3rd century, cracks were already forming. In 235 AD, Emperor Alexander Severus was assassinated by his own troops. What followed was 50 years of chaos. 26 emperors, most of them murdered. Civil wars, regional breakaways, economic disruption. This period, called the Crisis of the 3rd Century, nearly destroyed Rome. But the empire survived. Diocletian and Constantine restructured the government, split administration into East and West, stabilized the currency, fortified the borders. By the year 330 AD, Rome appeared to have recovered. Constantinople became the new eastern capital. The frontiers held. The system seemed to work again. But appearances were deceiving, because the structural problems that caused the crisis hadn't been solved. They had been papered over. And beneath the surface, the same forces that nearly destroyed Rome in the 3rd century were still eroding the foundations. ACTT, the trigger. The collapse didn't begin with an invasion. It began with climate change. Between 300 and 500 AD, Europe entered what historians call the Late Antique Little Ice Age. Average temperatures dropped, growing seasons shortened. Droughts and floods became more frequent. Harvests failed. Rome's economy was built on agricultural surplus. The cities depended on grain imports from North Africa and Egypt. The army depended on tax revenue to pay soldiers. When crop yields declined, the entire system started to wobble. At the same time, something was happening beyond the empire's northern frontier. Nomadic groups from Central Asia, collectively called the Huns, were migrating westward, pushing into Gothic territory. And the Goths, pressured by this wave of migration, began moving toward Roman borders. In 376 AD, tens of thousands of Gothic refugees arrived at the Danube River, asking for asylum. The Roman government, desperate for military recruits and farm labor, allowed them in. But the integration process collapsed almost immediately. Roman officials exploited the refugees, starving them, selling them spoiled food at inflated prices. Gothic families sold their children into slavery just to survive. Within 2 years, the Goths rebelled. On August 9, 378 AD, at the Battle of Adrianople, a Gothic army annihilated a Roman field force. Emperor Valens was killed. 2/3 of the Eastern Roman army was destroyed. It was the worst Roman military defeat in centuries. But here's what made Adrianople so devastating. It wasn't just a lost battle. It was a revelation. The myth of Roman invincibility, the psychological foundation of the empire's power, had been shattered. And once that myth was broken, it could never be restored. Rome didn't recover from Adrianople. It negotiated. The empire settled the Goths inside Roman territory, granting them semi-autonomous status in exchange for military service. It seemed pragmatic, but what it really meant was that Rome no longer controlled its own borders. And it set a precedent. Other groups saw that Rome would negotiate under pressure. The floodgates opened, ACT3, slow escalation. What followed wasn't a sudden invasion. It was a slow unraveling. Throughout the 5th century, Rome faced a continuous cascade of problems, each one manageable in isolation but cumulatively overwhelming. Barbarian groups, Vandals, Visigoths, Burgundians, Alemanni migrated into Roman territory. Some came as invaders. Others came as refugees. Many came as federates, semi-independent military allies. The distinctions blurred. Rome's response was always the same: negotiate, settle, integrate, grant land in exchange for military service, pay subsidies to keep the peace, co-opt barbarian leaders into the Roman hierarchy. It worked for a while, but every settlement weakened central authority. Every autonomous barbarian kingdom inside imperial borders reduced Rome's tax base. Every federate army meant fewer resources for the regular legions. The empire was hollowing out. Meanwhile, the economy was collapsing. Long-distance trade declined. Cities shrank. The currency debased. Wealthy landowners retreated to fortified rural estates, governing their own private territories. The middle class, the backbone of Roman civic life, disappeared. Historians call this process de-urbanization. But what it really was the failure of state capacity. Rome could no longer enforce law, collect taxes, or maintain infrastructure. The systems that held the empire together were breaking down. And then came the Vandals. In 429 AD, a Vandal army crossed from Spain into North Africa. Within a decade, they had conquered Carthage, the wealthiest city in the Western Mediterranean. Rome lost its grain supply. Worse, the Vandals built a fleet and began raiding Italy itself. In 455 AD, they sacked Rome. It wasn't like the Gothic sack of 410, which had been shocking but brief. This was systematic looting. 2 weeks of pillage. The Vandals stripped the city bare, but even that wasn't the end, because Rome had survived sacks before. What it couldn't survive was irrelevance. By the mid-5th century, real power in the Western Empire no longer rested with the emperor. It rested with barbarian generals who commanded the armies. Men like Ricimer, a half-Visigothic warlord who installed and deposed emperors at will. The throne became a puppet office. In practical terms, Rome had ceased to function as a centralized state. The provinces were ruled by barbarian kings. The army was composed of barbarian federates. The economy had localized. The emperor in Ravenna controlled almost nothing. And yet the fiction continued. Emperors were still crowned. Coins were still minted. Edicts were still issued. Because no one wanted to admit what had already happened. AACT4, the human cost for the people living through this collapse. The experience wasn't dramatic. It was grinding. Imagine you're a shopkeeper in a provincial town in Gaul around 450 AD. Your grandfather's generation lived under Roman law, paid Roman taxes, used Roman coins. You still do those things, technically. But the coins are increasingly worthless. The tax collectors come less often, and when they do, they're accompanied by armed men who look more like bandits. The local garrison pulled out years ago. The aqueduct hasn't been maintained in a generation. Trade goods that used to come from across the empire, olive oil from Spain, ceramics from North Africa, have dried up. You rely on local production now. The roads are crumbling. Brigands control the countryside. Your children won't learn to read Latin because there's no school anymore. But you don't think of this as the fall of Rome. You think of it as hard times, a temporary disruption. Surely things will return to normal. They never do. This is what societal collapse looks like from the inside. Not a sudden catastrophe, but a slow decline in the quality of life, the scope of opportunity, the reach of order. The world becomes smaller, darker, more dangerous. And it happens so gradually that each generation adapts, normalizes, forgets what was lost. Population declined. Life expectancy dropped. Literacy rates plummeted. Archaeological evidence shows that average building sizes shrank. Pottery quality declined. People stopped using coins in many areas, reverting to barter. This wasn't just political collapse. It was civilizational regression. And the people who experienced it had no framework to understand it, because no one living in the 5th century had ever known a world without Rome. The empire had existed for 500 years in the West, over 1,000 in the East. It seemed eternal, until it wasn't. c. 5. c. Change, 476 AD. Odoacer, a barbarian general, deposes Romulus Augustulus and declares himself king of Italy. He doesn't proclaim a new empire. He simply stops pretending. He sends the imperial regalia to Constantinople and acknowledges the Eastern emperor as nominal overlord. But in practice, the Western Roman Empire is over. Here's what's strange. Almost no one noticed. There were no contemporary accounts marking it as a historic turning point. No speeches about the end of an era. Because for most people, nothing changed. The same barbarian warlords who had been ruling in the emperor's name just kept ruling. The collapse had already happened. 476 was just the moment someone acknowledged it. So what came next? Fragmentation. The Western Roman Empire dissolved into barbarian kingdoms. Visigoths in Spain, Franks in Gaul, Ostrogoths in Italy, Vandals in North Africa. Each kingdom retained some Roman administrative structures, Roman law, Roman titles, but they were no longer part of a unified system. Trade networks collapsed. Urban centers shrank to a fraction of their former size. Literacy declined sharply by the 7th century. Even many priests couldn't read Latin. Technological knowledge was lost. Concrete, aqueduct engineering, long-distance coordination. This period used to be called the Dark Ages. Historians don't use that term anymore, partly because it's Eurocentric, partly because it implies nothing of value happened. But in terms of material complexity, state capacity, and quality of life, it was a profound regression. It would take Europe 500 years to rebuild the population levels Rome had sustained, 1,000 years to match its engineering. The systems that had held together 50 million people under a single legal framework simply vanished. But here's the crucial point. The collapse wasn't inevitable. It was the result of specific choices, structural vulnerabilities, and cascading failures. Rome didn't fall because of a single barbarian invasion. It fell because the empire had become too expensive to defend, too fragmented to govern, too unequal to sustain loyalty. It fell because climate stress exposed economic fragility, because wealth concentration hollowed out the middle class, because short-term political compromises compounded into long-term structural decay. And most of all, it fell because the people running the system prioritized their own survival over the system's survival. Emperors cared more about staying in power than fixing the problems. Generals extracted wealth instead of defending borders. Landowners hoarded resources instead of paying taxes. By the time anyone realized the empire itself was at risk, it was too late to save. Completention. So, was it preventable? That's the question that haunts historians. Could different policies have saved Rome? Stronger borders? Economic reform? More inclusive governance? Military investment? Maybe. But the deeper problem was that the people with the power to make those changes didn't experience the collapse the way ordinary people did. Elites were insulated. They retreated to fortified estates. They hired private armies. They accumulated gold and land while the empire crumbled around them. For them, the collapse wasn't a catastrophe. It was a transition. Many Roman aristocrats became barbarian nobles. The wealth stayed in the same families. The system changed, but the hierarchy didn't. This is the pattern that repeats throughout history. Societal collapse doesn't hit everyone equally, and the people best positioned to prevent it are often the least motivated to do so. Rome's fall teaches us that even the most powerful, sophisticated, deeply entrenched systems can disintegrate. not through sudden shock, but through accumulated dysfunction, not because of external enemies, but because of internal decay. And the most unsettling part? The collapse is often invisible to those living through it, until the moment it becomes irreversible. Rome didn't fall in a day. It fell over decades as systems broke down, trust eroded, and the future became unthinkable. The people living through it adapted, normalized, hoped for recovery, but recovery never came. The question we're left with is this: when a system is collapsing, how do you know? And more importantly, if you did know, could you stop it?